Okay, so now we're going to switch our focus to socialism, which is what we've been building towards this entire time in our conversations about Marx. We have to talk about a few different aspects of socialism. I think there are about four. So before we jump to socialism, though, I do just want to give you guys a brief reminder of how we got to where we are now. So if you remember, we divided Marx's stages of history, his epochs, into these 5 stages. Other people divide things up in different ways. So I think even the textbook reading that I gave you has some slight differences. But for our purposes, this is approaches what we need. This is fine for us. So we move from primitive communism, or humans move from primitive communism to slave societies to feudalism to capitalism, and ultimately to socialism/communism. Again, I separate 4 and 5 with a line because no one has reached socialism yet, at least according to Marx's definition of how that needs to happen, and we'll talk about why that is a bit later on. As we move from one stage to the next, we are moving towards increased freedom. So by that, we mean, or we're thinking in terms of people's control over their own lives, people's control over themselves. So primitive communists have the least amount of freedom, and then we progressively move towards increased freedom. In capitalism, capitalism provides for the most freedom that any economic system has allowed in human history, but it's not the end point. Ultimately, we'll reach socialism, which will be the most freedom we can have. And it's not total freedom in the sense that we can just do whatever we want. It's the most amount of freedom that human beings can really have. So one last reminder, one overarching theme, one key point that I've been trying to emphasize over and over again is that Marx really focuses on the ways in which each economic system's internal problems, internal tensions, internal conflicts ultimately destroy the system and push it into the next system. So the features of primitive communism ultimately lead primitive communism to destroy itself. Out of primitive communism will emerge slave society. It's really key to understand that the destruction of one economic system lends itself to the emergence of a particular other system. It's not just that primitive communism collapses and then anything that can come out of that. It's particularly slave societies that are going to come out of primitive communism, at least according to Marx. When we get to Weber, we'll see how Weber critiques that. But from Marx's perspective, that's what's happening. So we need to move from society to society. So every one of these steps is a necessary step on the path to what Marx will see as ultimate freedom. So we talked previously about how socialism, according to Marx, will be the end of history. So we want to talk about what that means. Well, for Marx, history is change. History is these big changes like wars, like technological developments, like these revolutions in economic systems. You can think about when a new president gets elected and new policies get enacted, then that gets recorded in history books. If you think back to any history book you've ever read, if it's the history of Western civilization, you're reading the history of empires and how they grow and change and consume more of the world over time. If you're reading American history, usually American history is broken up in terms of presidential terms or split up by wars or whatever. But there's always conflict and always change that's driving history forward. And for Marx, the ultimate source of all that conflict is conflict between different social groups, specifically social classes, driving history forward. But socialism will ultimately be classless, and I'll talk about what that will mean in a little bit. But because socialism will ultimately be classless, it will be without classes, then there will be no source of conflict. And because there's no conflict, there's no change. And because there's no change, there's no history. Now, that doesn't mean that people aren't going to be alive. It doesn't mean that people aren't going to be getting up and going to work every day. It doesn't mean that people aren't going to be doing things. They will. They certainly will. But what this ultimately does mean is that there will be no major changes to the structure of society, no big revolutions, no massive social upheavals. So what does it mean to say that socialism will be classless? So if we're going to make the case that there's not going to be conflict, then we have to make the case that there'll be no source of conflict. And the major source of conflict for Marx is conflict between classes. So in capitalism, it's the conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. In feudalism, it's between serfs and the landholding classes, and also the church, which we didn't really talk about, but they're key too. But in socialism, there will be no classes. So how is that going to happen? Well, first we need to think about what we mean by the word social class. This is a pretty confusing idea. So if we think about the word class, class implies a distinction between groups. So you can never have a situation where you have just one social class. It doesn't make any sense to say there's one social class. Because to say that there is a class means that there are at least two, because classes are always going to stand in opposition to each other. So let me give you an example that is it's going to seem completely random. It's got nothing to do with Marx, but I'm hoping it just illustrates this idea that you sometimes need two of something in order to have that thing at all. So you need at least two classes. You can have more than two classes, but you need to have at least two classes to say there are any classes. So take the example of the word up. So the word up, right? We have up, we have down. Imagine we just, as a society, decide, all right, we're only going to have the word up. We are never again going to use the word down. Well, that doesn't make any sense, because the word up only makes sense if there's also down. What would up even mean if we didn't have a word down? It makes no sense. The concept of social class is the same way. So, for instance, if we're going to have a class called the proletariat, we need to have a class that's the bourgeoisie. Class implies distinction and implies separation. So if there are no separations, if there are no distinctions, then there are no classes. No classes. Okay? Well, how do we end up in a situation where there are no classes in socialism? Well, for Marx, he makes the case that once the proletariat rise up and destroy the bourgeoisie, however they do that, whether it's a bloody revolution or whether it's completely peaceful, it doesn't matter. When the proletariat destroy the bourgeoisie, they also destroy themselves as a class. So if you remember, the bourgeoisie own the means of production. The proletariat have only their labor to sell. Well, in order for the proletariat to be the proletariat, they have to be selling their labor. Who can they sell their labor to if the bourgeoisie is gone? Well, they're not going to sell their labor to anybody. So if the people who were part of the proletariat, after they destroy the bourgeoisie, have no one to sell their labor to, well, they're not in the proletariat anymore. Doesn't make sense to say they are, because their fundamental feature is that they sell their labor, but they're not selling their labor anymore. So the bourgeoisie is destroyed. If everyone in the bourgeoisie is killed off, then they're dead. If it's a peaceful revolution, then everyone who was previously in the bourgeoisie will now become part of the mass of people who are left behind. They're part of this one big class that isn't a class, because since there is only one class at that point, there are no classes, as it doesn't make sense that there's only one class. And at that point, all people will essentially be equal in terms of the economic system, and there'll be no conflict. Now you have to remember, when we're thinking about equality here, we're not thinking that everyone is going to be as attractive or as skilled or as whatever as everybody else. That's not to say there's not going to be any kind of social distinction. There might not be any social distinction, but the things that we think of now as being typically that separate us will go away. We'll all have the same relationship to the means of production, so we'll all essentially be the same. And that sameness, that lack of classes, will mean there's no conflict. I also want to point out one more thing. When I say that everyone's going to be the same, I don't mean that everyone's going to have the exact same personality, or everyone's going to think the exact same way. Socialism is going to open up a space for people to think about things in their own way. It's going to open up more opportunities for debate between people, more opportunities for personality differences and the expression of individual personality, according to Marx. It doesn't mean we're all going to be the same, like a bunch of generic clones of each other who all think and do the same things. Socialism will allow us to really be ourselves, according to Marx. Then there's this question of what will socialism actually be like on a day-to-day basis. And Marx offers a pretty surprising answer, I think, here. And his answer is that he doesn't know. So Marx says straight out that he does not know what socialism is going to be like. Because it makes sense. In some ways, it's a kind of a humble position, which is unusual for Marx, because he's not really one for humility usually, at least in my understanding of him. But he makes the case that trying to predict exactly what socialism will be like would be like someone who is living in feudal times trying to predict what capitalism is going to be like. Well, someone who is a feudal peasant or a medieval king, or even someone who is a merchant or an artisan who that social group would ultimately become the bourgeoisie later on, they're not in a position to know because they can't see the future. They don't know exactly how all this is going to play out. We don't have the perspective to see what's going to happen. Now, given that limited perspective, Marx does make the case that these right here are going to be features of the system. So, just giving you a heads up, I pulled this list straight out of the Communist Manifesto, except I realize now that there are a couple of typos that I made, but they're, for all intents and purposes, direct quotes. So, just giving you a heads up about that. So, points out, for instance, there's going to be abolition of property and land and application of all rents of land for public purposes. So, private property will go away, and it will all land will become public. Abolition of all rights of inheritance. So you'll have an income. That income will be heavily taxed, but you will have an income. But ultimately, though, you will have an income, but you won't be able to pass that income, that wealth, on to your kids and so on. The idea being, my sense of what Marx is getting at here is that you don't want people to be able to build up massive amounts of wealth over generations. One, because there's an idea that it's bad for the kids themselves, because if you have a bunch of wealth handed to you, then you're not going to be motivated to go out there and do anything. But there's also just the fact that you don't want people building up massive amounts of wealth on their own. Some of these things that's really interesting we already have. So, for instance, free education for all children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, and so on. So, some of this stuff has come to pass, but a lot of it has not. So you can take a look at this. Again, it's in the Communist Manifesto. But so the main point is that Marx doesn't really know what socialism is going to look like. He does think it's going to happen. He's actually convinced that socialism will ultimately come into existence. But the only real guide he gives us is this right here, and maybe a couple other writings and a couple other spots. But he never really lays out an argument for what socialism is going to look like. Again, because he says it's impossible to know. And the last point I want to make is something that I promised to cover early on. And it's this question of why is capitalism necessary for socialism? So I made the case early on in the semester and even earlier on in this lecture that in order for one economic system to come into existence, it has to emerge from a particular other economic system. Which means that from Marx's perspective, capitalism has to be followed by socialism. You can't have socialism unless you had capitalism. So if you look at places like Soviet Russia or China or Cuba, those countries were not capitalist before they became communist. Russia almost became capitalist, but it ended up going socialist instead, or calling itself socialist or communist. And there's a reason why. Those countries are really communist in name only. They're not really communist. So capitalism is exploitative and alienating, according to Marx, but capitalism is really, really good at producing things. Capitalism is incredibly dynamic. If you look at the economic growth that's occurred throughout the existence of humanity, the overwhelming majority of that growth has taken place since capitalism started. So where nomadic hunter-gatherers subsisted on the land that they had in their territory, farmers produced the food that they could. There were developments in farming, but they were slow. And if you went back in time to the year 1000 BC, it wouldn't really be all that much different as compared to the year 1000 AD. There would be differences, but they're going to be very similar too, because not a lot changed. The capitalism is really, really great at producing lots of things, and this drive for profit that capitalists have, that the bourgeoisie have, is going to drive the development of lots of factories, lots of industry. It's going to drive research. It's going to drive science. It's going to drive lots and lots and lots of development. Now, once capitalism falls, though, those things like factories, like infrastructure, like our national highway system, like the internet, all those things that allow us to do work, and things like scientific knowledge and our advances in health, all of those things are going to be there. So Marx's idea of socialism is that you're going to have people who are living essentially free lives. Now, people still need to eat, though. They need the basics to survive. So we're still going to have to work, but we're not going to have to work very much, at least not work in the sense that the members of the proletariat worked, where they were doing work that was essentially alienating. Because we can take all of those factories that up to this point had been producing stupid things like bobblehead dolls and decorative spatulas and all kinds of stuff that we don't really need. We can turn that industrial capacity towards the production of, for instance, food and our necessities and things that will make our lives actually better. And if we stop working on producing things that we don't need a lot of, it's going to take very little effort. It's going to take very little actual time and human effort to produce that food, to produce those clothes, to produce all those things. We won't have that same need to consume that we had in capitalism. So it will have to work, but very, very little. That will leave us with lots of free time to not be lazy. Marx is going to argue that we're not going to choose to be lazy. What we're going to do is we're going to turn our focus to those things that allow us to express our humanity, which is specifically our capacity to work creatively. So if you're really interested in science and you want to generate scientific knowledge, you can go do that. If you are an artist and you want to produce art, you can go do that. Marx has a famous quote where he says, in socialism, you can be a fisherman in the morning and I'm butchering this, I should have checked it before I did this lecture, a poet in the evening and something else, the next day or something. But we're going to be able to do essentially what we want, although, a small amount of our time is going to be dedicated towards producing the basics. But there's going to be so much infrastructure and so much productive capacity that's going to be easy and take relatively little time. Now, societies that try to skip capitalism, societies that try to jump from, for instance, feudalism to socialism, they're not going to be able to do it because you can't have a socialist society in which all of its workers spend their time just trying to, for instance, produce enough food to survive or produce the basics of life. Those people are not going to be able to live in freedom. They're too focused on survival, just like primitive communists, just like people in the slave societies, just like people in feudalism. They're focused on producing to survive. They don't have time to express their humanity through creative labor. So you need the productive capacity that comes out of capitalism in order to have socialism. You take that away, you cannot have socialism. So that's why it's key. So, again, this is another shot at the idea that Marx just hated capitalism and thought we should never have had it or something. No, he sees capitalism as an essential stage in history. And so that wraps up the socialism lecture, and it also is going to wrap up our conversation about Marx. So I understand that a lot of this might be confusing. You probably have quite a few questions, or very likely have quite a few questions. One big one is like, well, why in socialism will people choose to do anything? Why won't they be lazy? We can talk about things like that if you would like. But yeah, so feel free to let me know if you are left with things that need explaining. Okay, thanks.